Hi there, welcome to the next video in my sequence looking at using Axis and Ohs to program mostly the X-Touch Mini, but also looking at the Stream Deck. Now that I've got the honeycomb, yoke and throttle quadrant working. This follows on directly from a previous video, so what I do is, again, as usual, I will put a link into the description, and I will put a card that will come up at the top so that you can backtrack and see what came before if you've just landed in this one. Let's get into the cockpit, and I'll put a little version of the camera onto my X-Touch up here. And really there's only one button here left to program, and that's this VNAV. Everything else, apart from the flight director, which we did in the last video, which is an easy one to program, everything else is available on the honeycomb throttle quadrant. So it's just the VNAV that we have to program. And I went to do the allocation in the normal way and set up a filter for VNAV and discovered there are a couple of options, and really I was dithering between this one here, which is GPS VNAV button being pressed, and this one here, which is a script written in RPM to toggle it. And it turns out it's the script that we have to use, not that one. That one didn't do anything for me. So if I was going to allocate that, again, apply the filter, VNAV, apply, double click on there, and it puts it in as if it's a key event, and then you click on add. So you press the button, click on add, but I've already done that, so I don't need to do it again. That's already allocated to that button. However, it does use a script, and I'm not sure when the script appeared. In the very early days of using Axis and Ohs, it wasn't there, and it's appeared. Whether it came, I presume it came as an update at some point with Axis and Ohs, but I might have got it from somewhere else, because I have downloaded a few other profiles off of a website. So in case you haven't got it, and you need to, you have to type it in. There's the text here, and it's quite small on the screen, so if I just sort of read it through with you so you can see what it says. It's in brackets here. We're going to read the LVAR, so LVAR, and it's an XML variable, so it's XML VAR underscore VNAV button value, comma, number, and there's a space there between the comma and the number, and the space is marked as a dot. You just press the space bar and it puts a dot in. So it's XMLR var underscore VNAV button value number, and then this function here just basically inverts it. It does an OR, I think. Can't remember now. Just use it. But it inverts the number. So if it's a 0, it becomes 1. If it's a 1, it becomes 0. And then write that back into the same variable. So the text there for the variable is exactly the same, except it's got this greater than sign, which is not a greater than, it's an input sign. So input that value into here. So it's a great way of doing a toggle. If you don't want to have a toggle, or you can't find a toggle, that's a great way of writing one nice line of script. Okay, so that's done. In my next video, I'm going to do a test flight to show you the VNAV working, so you can see how to use VNAV and see that the button does work. So that's my next video. So that's really it. I think that's everything I need to do for the X-Touch. So if we get rid of that X-Touch now for a second, and let's have a look at the Stream Deck. Now, if you see my previous videos, I had a Logitech mouse and throttle, and they don't have any switches on them really. So everything was done on the Stream Deck. So this was dealt with in huge detail on previous videos. But I don't really need them anymore, because I've got the battery on the honeycomb yoke the alternator, the avionics switches. In fact, these get overwritten if I turn the beacon on. I can now press the button on my Stream Deck and it gets overwritten by the hardware. Or if it's switched off and I switch it on here, I've got the danger that it's out of sync, it's not on the hardware. So don't really want to use these as switches. They're okay having them as visual gauges. I don't mind them being there. It saves me sort of looking down on the screen, because my the Stream Deck sits on top of the throttle quadrant, so it brings it closer to me. So they're okay as visual switches, as visual sort of gauges, but I'm not going to use them to control things anymore. So that's the same for all of these buttons here. These two I've programmed into the throttle quadrant, so I don't need those. There's a flaps lever on the throttle quadrant, so that's just a visual gauge. The same with the shut-off valve and the parking brake. All of those are programmed in. They're on the throttle quadrant, so they're working absolutely fine. The keys, that's built into the hardware of the honeycomb yoke. This is the lighting panel which I wrote to control the cabin lights and the panel lights, but they're programmed into rotaries on the X-Touch, so there's no use for that at all anymore. Obviously on the MFD over here, when you're in flight, there's the RPM gauge there. These are really here partly to practice making a gauge if I wanted to. And that one there, I did it to make sure that my throttle and mixture were allocated correctly in Axis and Ohs, which it clearly is, so I don't really need those. That was just for debugging purposes. Exhaust gas temperature is interesting. I find, and I've seen a number of people complaining, that the exhaust gas temperature gauge that comes up there is pretty unreadable, probably not very accurate. It doesn't seem to move very much. It's not that great for fine tuning your mixture when you're trying to lean the engine. So that gauge is better, works pretty well. But is it a bit of a cheat? Should you be not using the system that comes with the aircraft, having an extra gauge? I don't know. There is a system built into the MFD for leaning the mixture and looking at the engine condition. So perhaps have a look at that when I do the flight to test the VNAV, and we'll look at that. So what's left to me that I do use? Well, the ability to change my views from cockpit to external to drone and to look around. I find that quite useful. So I'm keeping that system there, so I can flick around there. So that's nice. And the PFD, that there's a lot of text underneath the buttons, and in flight, sort of count along how far across here you've got to find the button you want, and clicking on here is a bit difficult. So say I wanted the PFD options, I've got that programmed so that when I press on that, it changes to a different profile with the correct script. So when I press on the various buttons, it does what it's supposed to do, and then click back. Now again, I've done lots of video on how that works. The only difficulty I've got with it is that because this GPS system is used in a number of aircraft, I want to sort of reuse the profile without having to have lots of copies of it. So there's no way of knowing which aircraft called the profile when you clicked on it. So there's no way to know where to go back to. So I just go back to the hangar and then back into the aircraft that I'm flying. So it's 2 button presses to get where I want to be. And that works okay. The MFD side of things really doesn't work particularly well, so I'm kind of ditching it, and I'm going to go back to my old MFD. So I've got this new one that I tried to write, and then I'm going to probably go back to the old one, because let's go to look at the new one, the new MFD. Again, the text varies depending on where you are, and if I click on engine, it should bring me to another system. But the text varies not only as a result of which buttons you pressed. I'm pressing the back button on the Stream Deck now. It also varies depending on the rotary switch, the MFD rotary switch, when you start to go into flight planning mode or waypoints and things like that. And there's no way that this system here can detect that you've moved across from one screen to another, so they get completely out of sequence. So I'm probably going to stick with this system here. You don't use it that often, and it's not so dense, there aren't so many functions, so it's possible to use it. The other thing that I do use a lot is the ATC calls. So I click on here, and so obviously when you click on there, the menu comes up, and you've got press 1 for read back, and 2 for this, and 3 for that, and that varies quite a lot. So these are just built so that you look at the menu system and you say, well, it's the same as pressing 1, 2, 3 on the keyboard, but it's on my Stream Deck. So that's quite easy to set up. But I want to be able to open and close the window that so I've got the menu coming up and going away, and that's what this is about. Click on there, should bring up the air traffic control window, and I'm pressing the button. You can probably hear it through the microphone, and nothing's happening, because it has to be that the Microsoft software, the flight simulator, has the input focus, because it's emulating you pressing the keyboard. So if I press the button now, you'll see it come up and go away. But if I click onto, I've got a map up on the my second monitor, and if I click on that map, that key now doesn't work. So that's one of the minor problems you've got. The other problem that you've got is that it's normally brought up by the scroll key. And if I went to, let's show you, I'll reallocate that button as if I'm doing it from fresh. So it's a function that's built into Stream Deck. It's nothing to do with Lorbe's, Axis and Ohs. It's a basic Stream Deck function we're using, emulating a key, a hotkey that you've pressed. And normally you just type in what you want the button to be called, and you would click, and it would look at your keystrokes. And normally it's the scroll lock that's used to bring up the menu, but if you press the scroll lock, it doesn't get observed. And I've found that when I've written other bits of software, working with Arduinos and things like that, that the scroll key isn't part of the ASCII or the Unicode definitions. It's not in most of the keyboard maps. You have to dig quite deep into the system to detect whether you've pressed the scroll lock, in my experience. So that doesn't really work particularly well. If we just hop out for a minute and look at the control options on the keyboard, and we'll do a search for ATC, at some point, I didn't realize it had happened, that they put in a second alternative. They put in right shift and slash as well as scroll lock. Perhaps they've discovered that as a problem, but that's appeared, which is nice. Let's resume the flight and let's go back into here. So if I go to press the shift, and you can do them in sequence, you don't have to do them simultaneously, but you see it just says shift, and it actually determined that it was going to be right shift. So let's make sure that's got the input focus, and I press the button and it's not coming up. It has to be the right shift that we allocate there. So what we actually need to do is to drop into here and say I want you to differentiate between the left and right. So now if I click to assign here, you see it actually puts in right shift. So that will work now. If I click away, there's no submit or allocate button, it's just done automatically. So if I click away now and press on that key that I've just programmed, you can see, again, subject to this being having the input focus, that will come up. What I normally do actually is bring up the menu, and then I use this button here to park it onto a second monitor so it can stay open the whole flight. It's available to me, visible to me the whole time on a second monitor. You can program it into the X-Touch as well, using Axis and Ohs. If I bring up Axis and Ohs, so if I allocate it to the press switch on the end of here, yeah, I'll do that, I'll program it onto there. So if I go to allocate it, what we're going to do is to use a virtual event, and I'm going to do it as if it's a virtual keyboard. I haven't got any of these, so click on here, and now if I click on my scroll lock, interestingly enough, this one does emulate the scroll quite happily. So it'll say scroll, and now you press the button you want to allocate it to. So I'm going to allocate it to this one here and click on add. Still needs to have the input focus, it doesn't override that. But there it is, coming on and off, so it's allocated to the push switch here. So it is possible to do it, but if I click off onto something else on the other screen and press that button, it doesn't work. But click back on the simulator, it's working fine. So that's my ATC calls. Now I use that in quite a few places. I'll bring my Stream Deck back in. I use it if I'm in the main screen, I want to be able to access it. If I happen to be working on the PFD and something happens, I need to talk to air traffic control, it's there. If I'm in my MFD, it's available to me. So all I did was I just copy and then go to everywhere else I am and paste it in. And so I've got the identical folder all over the place really on this profile. So that's it. That's how I've got it set up. I'm not going to there's nothing to add to this. It will only be taking things away, so I'm just going to leave it here. The Stream Deck sits in front of me on the yoke so that I can look down and see the states of switches and gauges and things, but I'm not going to be using it very much at the moment. When I get to more complex aircraft, of course, there'll be things that I can't program in, or too many things to program into the available switches, so I'll be back on the Stream Deck later. So my next video will be doing a VNAV test flight to test all the systems, show the VNAV working, and perhaps have a play with getting the mixture sorted out and see if I can do it using the built-in systems on the MFD, or do I rely on this gauge? Okay, I'll see you in the next video.